You do the right thing. You expect a simple thank you. You certainly don't expect it to destroy your life. Yesterday evening, a 28-year-old waitress named Sarah Jenkins cracked the ribs of one of Chicago's wealthiest real estate moguls to save him from choking to death on a piece of seared Wagyu beef. She was a hero. The entire dining room watched her do it. But before the ambulance even pulled away from the curb, she was stripped of her apron and fired on the spot for creating a scene and violating VIP protocol. Left out in the freezing cold with $0 to her name, Sarah thought her life was over. She had no idea that 24 hours later, a single knock on her apartment door would flip the power dynamic of the entire city and change her life forever. The kitchen of Laura, Chicago's most pretentious Michelin-starred restaurant, smelled fiercely of black truffles, charred rosemary, and raw stress. It was Friday night, 7:45 p.m., and the ticket printer was screaming. Sarah Jenkins stood by the stainless steel pass, ignoring the sharp, stabbing pain radiating from the arches of her feet. She had been on the clock since 10 a.m., pulling a double shift she had practically begged for. Her younger sister's tuition at Northwestern was due in 3 weeks. Her own rent was late, and her bank account was hovering dangerously close to a 2-digit balance. Sarah wasn't here to complain. She was here to survive. "Table 12 needs their amuse-bouche, Sarah. Move it," barked Chef Francois, a man whose temper was as famous as his heavily buttered tasting menus. "Heard, Chef," Sarah said, balancing a silver tray on her fingertips. She smoothed down her pristine, suffocatingly tight black vest, checked her reflection in the glass of the swinging doors, and pushed her way out into the dining room. Stepping into the main dining area of Laura was like stepping into another dimension. The chaotic screaming of the kitchen vanished, replaced by the soft, hushed murmur of old money, the gentle clinking of baccarat crystal, and the low hum of a jazz trio playing in the corner. The lighting was impossibly dim, designed to make the diamonds on the patrons' necks sparkle. To the people sitting at these tables, Sarah wasn't a 28-year-old woman with a degree in finance she couldn't afford to finish. She was a ghost. She was a pair of hands that made empty plates disappear and full wine glasses manifest. She dropped off the appetizers at table 12 with a practiced, tight-lipped smile, spinning away just as the restaurant's general manager, Greg Farnsworth, intercepted her. Greg was a tall, excessively manicured man who wore bespoke suits that were slightly too tight and reeked of Tom Ford cologne. He ran the floor of Laura like a petty tyrant, reserving his smiles strictly for anyone with a net worth over 10 million. "Sarah," Greg hissed, grabbing her elbow and pulling her behind the mahogany host stand out of the guests' line of sight. "Listen to me very carefully. Table 4 is here. Do you know who is at table 4? Sarah glanced across the room toward the oversized corner booth. "Harrison Whitmore," she said quietly. "Exactly. Harrison Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Holdings, the man who practically owns the skyline of this city. He is dining with his chief operating officer, Diane Caldwell, and 2 prospective investors from London. This is a multi-million-dollar dinner, Sarah. Everything must be flawless. You are the lead server for that section. If a single crumb remains on that table between courses, or if his glass drops below the halfway mark, I will personally ensure you never work in hospitality in this state again. Am I clear?" "Crystal clear, Greg," Sarah replied, fighting the urge to roll her eyes. Greg gave this speech every time a billionaire walked in, but Harrison Whitmore was undeniably a big fish. He was 55, fiercely intimidating, known for his ruthless corporate takeovers, and rarely gave interviews. Sitting in the booth, dressed in a charcoal Brioni suit, he looked exhausted, rubbing his temples as the woman next to him, Diane Caldwell, sharp-featured and dripping in pearls, spoke rapidly to the British investors. "Good," Greg sneered. "Now go water them. Quietly." Sarah approached the table like a shadow. As she leaned in to pour the sparkling water, she couldn't help but overhear the conversation. "The zoning permits for the Southside project are stalling, Harrison," Diane was saying, her voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "If we don't push the city council by Monday, the British consortium will walk." Harrison sighed deeply, looking down at his menu without reading it. "I am aware, Diane. Let's just enjoy the meal for 5 minutes, shall we?" Diane pursed her lips, clearly annoyed by his humanity. "Time is money, Harrison. We aren't here for the duck." Sarah finished pouring, completely ignored by the party, and retreated to the perimeter of the room. She stood at her designated station, hands clasped behind her back, watching. Her co-worker, Chloe, bumped shoulders with her. "Rough crowd," Chloe whispered. "The usual," Sarah muttered. "Rich people who don't even like each other, pretending to have a good time so they can make more money they don't need." "Just smile and think of the tip," Chloe said, patting Sarah's back before rushing off to deliver a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir. Sarah took a deep breath. Think of the tip. That was the mantra. That was the only reason she endured Greg's bullying, the chef screaming, and the sheer physical exhaustion. Just 2 more hours, she told herself. 2 more hours and she could go home. But fate, it seemed, had a very different timeline. The main courses arrived at table 4 at precisely 8:30 p.m. Chef Francois had prepared a special off-menu item for Harrison Whitmore, a heavily marbled cut of Japanese A5 Wagyu beef, seared to a perfect medium rare, resting over a bed of parsnip puree. Sarah and 3 other servers performed the swarm, a synchronized placement of the plates, lifting the silver cloches in perfect unison. "Enjoy your meal, Mr. Whitmore," Sarah murmured, stepping back into the shadows. Harrison gave a brief, distracted nod, already cutting into the meat, while Diane Caldwell continued to aggressively outline the quarterly projections. Sarah stood by the pillar, observing. 10 minutes passed. The jazz band shifted into a slow, melancholic tune. Then, the rhythm of the room broke. It started small, a sharp, sudden intake of breath from table 4. Sarah's eyes snapped toward the booth. Harrison Whitmore had dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against the fine bone china. He was coughing, a harsh, wet sound. He reached for his water glass with a trembling hand, but knocked it over. The crystal shattered against the mahogany table, ice water spilling over the white linen and splashing onto Diane's silk dress. "Harrison, really?" Diane snapped, brushing the water off her lap, completely oblivious to what was actually happening. But Sarah saw it. She saw Harrison's face flush a deep, unnatural shade of crimson. She saw his hands fly up to his throat, his fingers clawing at his collar, ripping the top button of his expensive shirt off. He wasn't coughing anymore. There was no sound at all. His eyes were wide, bulging with sheer, primal panic. He was choking, completely, totally choking. "Sir?" the British investor opposite him asked, half standing. "Are you all right?" Harrison couldn't answer. His lips were beginning to turn a terrifying shade of blue. He stumbled, trying to stand up, but his knees buckled. He hit the edge of the table, sending more silverware crashing to the floor, before collapsing to his knees in the narrow aisle. The entire dining room went dead silent. The jazz band stopped playing. 50 of Chicago's wealthiest elites froze in their chairs, staring at the billionaire dying on the floor. "Do something!" Diane shrieked, finally realizing the gravity of the situation. She stood up, looking around wildly, but she didn't move toward him. She stepped back. Greg Farnsworth sprinted out from behind the host stand. He skidded to a halt a few feet from Harrison, his face pale with horror. "Oh my God! Oh my God, Mr. Whitmore! Someone call an ambulance! Call 911!" Greg yelled, but he just stood there, waving his hands uselessly. Nobody was moving. Sarah didn't think. The adrenaline hit her bloodstream like a freight train. Years ago, before the financial ruin, before her mother's illness, she had taken an advanced first aid course while working as a lifeguard. Instinct took over. She threw her serving tray onto an empty table and sprinted across the dining room, her sensible black shoes slipping slightly on the polished marble floor. "Move!" Sarah shouted, shoving Greg forcefully out of the way. Greg stumbled back, stunned. She dropped behind Harrison Whitmore. The man was a heavy, broad-shouldered mogul, and Sarah was barely 5'4", but the adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm going to help you!" she yelled in his ear. She hauled him up by his armpits, dragging him from his knees to a standing position. He was dead weight, his body spasming, as his brain was starved of oxygen. Sarah wrapped her arms around his thick waist, locating his navel. She formed a fist with her right hand, placed the thumb side just above his belly button, and grabbed her fist tightly with her left hand. 1. She pulled inward and upward with a brutal, sharp thrust. Harrison let out a muffled squeak, but the blockage didn't budge. "Come on!" Sarah grunted, adjusting her stance, planting her feet wide for leverage. 2. She thrust again, harder this time. She could feel the rigid resistance of his ribs against her arms. The dining room was holding its collective breath. Diane Caldwell was practically hyperventilating against the wall. 3. Sarah pulled with every ounce of physical power in her body. There was a sickening crack, the sound of a rib giving way under the immense pressure. Suddenly, a massive chunk of half-chewed Wagyu beef shot out of Harrison's mouth like a bullet, landing violently on the pristine white tablecloth of an adjacent table. Harrison collapsed forward. Sarah went down with him, unable to hold his weight any longer. They both hit the floor hard. Instantly, the terrifying silence of the restaurant was shattered by the sound of Harrison Whitmore dragging oxygen into his lungs. It was a loud, ugly, raspy gasp. He rolled onto his side, coughing violently, tears streaming down his red face, taking massive, greedy gulps of air. Sarah sat back on her heels, her chest heaving, her hands shaking violently. She stared at him, ensuring his chest was rising and falling normally. "You're okay," Sarah breathed out, wiping sweat from her forehead. "You're okay. Just keep breathing." The spell on the room broke. Suddenly there was chaos. People were murmuring loudly. Cell phones were out. Someone was crying. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing rapidly louder, echoing through the canyons of the Chicago streets. Diane Caldwell finally rushed forward, kneeling next to her boss. But she didn't look relieved. She looked mortified. "Harrison! Harrison, don't move! Paramedics are coming! Oh, this is a disaster! An absolute public relations disaster! People are filming!" Greg Farnsworth was suddenly there, pushing Sarah out of the way. "Back away, Sarah! Get away from him!" Greg hissed, his face red with panic and fury. Sarah scrambled backward, stunned by the aggression. She bumped into a chair, watching as the doors of Laura burst open and 3 EMTs rushed in with a stretcher and heavy medical bags. They swarmed Harrison, taking his vitals, applying an oxygen mask over his face. Sarah stood up, her knees knocking together. She looked around. The immaculate dining room was a wreck. Shattered glass, spilled wine, discarded chairs, and the terrified, whispering faces of the elite. She had done it. She had saved his life. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart, expecting someone, anyone, to ask if she was okay. Instead, a heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder. She turned to see Greg Farnsworth glaring at her, his eyes cold and furious. "My office? Now." Sarah followed Greg through the kitchen doors. The kitchen staff, having heard the commotion, were all frozen, staring at her as she walked by. Chef Francois didn't say a word. The silence in the back of house was almost heavier than the silence out in the dining room. Greg marched into his cramped, windowless office and slammed the door shut so hard the framed Michelin certificates on the wall rattled. Sarah stood awkwardly in front of his desk. Her hands were still trembling from the adrenaline. "Greg, the EMTs are there. He's breathing. I got it out." "Shut up!" Greg snapped, spinning around to face her. "Just shut your mouth." Sarah blinked, completely taken aback. "Excuse me? Do you have any idea what you just did?" Greg's voice was a low, terrifying whisper. He grabbed his hair, pacing behind his desk. "Do you have any concept of the liability you just exposed this restaurant to?" "Liability? I saved his life," Sarah protested, her voice rising. "He was choking, Greg. He was turning blue. You were just standing there." "I was assessing the situation to wait for the trained professionals," Greg fired back, pointing a manicured finger at her face. "You assaulted a billionaire in the middle of my dining room. Do you know what Diane Caldwell just said to me while the paramedics were loading him up? She said you broke his rib. She said you manhandled him, humiliated him in front of foreign investors, and caused a public spectacle that is probably trending on Twitter right now. I performed the Heimlich maneuver. Breaking a rib is a common side effect of doing it correctly. If I hadn't stepped in, he would be in a morgue right now," Sarah yelled, the sheer injustice of the accusation boiling her blood. The door to the office suddenly swung open. Diane Caldwell stood in the doorway. She looked immaculate, not a hair out of place, though her eyes were narrowed with a venomous fury. "Is this the girl?" Diane asked coldly, stepping into the room. "Miss Caldwell, please. I apologize for the intrusion. I am handling it." Greg groveled immediately, his entire posture shrinking in the presence of wealth. "You had better be," Diane said, looking at Sarah as if she were a cockroach that had scurried across her plate. "Mr. Whitmore is being transported to Northwestern Memorial. He is humiliated. Our London investors walked out. Do you understand the magnitude of the deal that was just ruined because of this chaotic circus?" Sarah stared at the woman in disbelief. "He was dying. Your boss was dying on the floor. He was choking. The paramedics were 3 minutes away," Diane said icily. "Instead of following protocol, you decided to play hero. You grabbed him, you broke his bone, and you turned a private medical moment into a public circus. Whitmore Holdings does not tolerate liabilities, and we certainly don't tolerate unvetted waitstaff laying hands on our executives." Diane turned to Greg. "If she is employed here by the time I reach the hospital, my office will ensure Laura loses its lease in this building by the end of the month. Mr. Whitmore owns this property. Remember that." Without waiting for a response, Diane turned on her expensive heels and walked out of the office. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah looked at Greg. Her heart was pounding so hard it hurt. "Greg, you can't be serious. You can't let her do this. I did the right thing." Greg wouldn't even look her in the eye. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a petty cash box, and counted out 3 $50 bills. He pushed them across the desk toward her. "That covers your shift tonight. Leave your apron and your name tag on the desk," Greg said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Greg, please," Sarah said, her voice finally breaking. The reality of the situation was crashing down on her. "My sister's tuition. My rent. I'm working double shifts. You know I need this job. You can't fire me for saving a man's life." "I am firing you for violating restaurant protocol and causing a disturbance," Greg replied coldly. "Take the cash, Sarah. Leave through the back alley. I don't want you seen in the dining room again. And consider yourself lucky Diane isn't pressing assault charges for that broken rib." Sarah stared at the money on the desk. A sick, hollow feeling hollowed out her stomach. The absolute unfairness of the world pressed down on her chest, heavier than any physical weight. She had saved a man. She had acted when everyone else was too cowardly or too polite to do anything, and her reward was financial ruin. With a shaking hand, she reached behind her back, untied the strings of her black apron, and let it pool onto Greg's desk. She didn't touch the money. "Keep it," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with held-back tears and raw rage. "You're going to need it to buy back whatever is left of your soul." She turned and walked out of the office. She ignored the sympathetic, pitying looks of the dishwashers and line cooks as she grabbed her coat from the break room. She pushed through the heavy metal back door and stepped out into the freezing Chicago night. The wind howled through the dark, trash-strewn alleyway. The temperature was well below freezing. Sarah zipped up her thin coat, wrapping her arms around herself as she walked toward the bus stop. She had nothing. No job, no references, no way to pay her bills. She felt like a fool, a stupid, naive fool who thought that doing a good deed actually mattered in a world run by money and power. As she sat on the icy metal bench, waiting for the midnight bus, snow beginning to fall around her, Sarah Jenkins pulled out her cracked smartphone. She had 3 missed calls from her sister, probably asking about the tuition money. A single tear escaped her eye, freezing almost instantly on her cheek. She thought her life had just hit rock bottom. She thought she was entirely invisible, chewed up and spat out by the elite. What Sarah didn't know, as she boarded the empty bus, was that in a private suite at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Harrison Whitmore had just regained full consciousness. The painkillers for his broken rib were kicking in, and his mind was perfectly clear. He looked at Diane Caldwell, who was standing by his bed, typing furiously on her phone. "Diane!" Harrison rasped, his voice rough and damaged. "Harrison! Thank God!" "The doctors say you'll be fine," Diane said, rushing to his side. "Don't worry about a thing. I've already handled the restaurant. The girl who assaulted you has been terminated, and I'm drafting an NDA for the staff." Harrison held up a hand. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, were burning with a terrifying intensity. "You fired her?" Harrison whispered. "Of course I did," Diane scoffed. "She was a liability." Harrison stared at his COO, the woman he had trusted to run his empire, and felt a profound, sudden shift in his universe. For the first time in 30 years, Harrison Whitmore had been completely helpless, and the only person who had stepped out of the shadows to save him had just been punished for it. "Diane," Harrison said softly, a dangerous edge creeping into his hoarse voice. "Get out." The silence in the VIP suite at Northwestern Memorial was vastly different from the silence in the restaurant. It wasn't heavy with judgment. It was sterile, punctuated only by the rhythmic beep of a monitor tracking Harrison Whitmore's heart rate. Harrison lay propped against the pillows, the high-grade pain medication dulling the throbbing ache in his side, where his rib had snapped. But the meds couldn't dull his mind. Not anymore. For 30 years, Harrison had built an empire on the ability to read people. He knew their price points, their weaknesses, their hidden agendas. He had surrounded himself with sharks like Diane Caldwell because he believed that in the cutthroat world of Chicago real estate, you needed killers on your payroll. He paid Diane 7 figures a year to be ruthless, efficient, and unsentimental. But tonight, as he stared at the ceiling, replaying those terrifying 90 seconds where his life belonged to no one, he realized he had miscalculated everything. When the meat had lodged in his throat, Harrison hadn't thought about his portfolio, his legacy, or his unfinished skyscrapers. He had felt a primal, animalistic terror. He had looked up, eyes bulging, silently begging for help. And he had seen Diane Caldwell step back. He remembered the look on her face. It wasn't concern for her dying friend and mentor. It was annoyance. It was a calculation of damage control. She was worried about her silk dress getting wet. Then there was the force, the sudden, shocking grip of small arms around his expansive midsection, the grit in that voice in his ear. "I'm going to help you." He hadn't seen her face then, only felt the sheer determination in her small frame. She hadn't hesitated. She hadn't cared about his suit, or the protocols, or the audience. She had simply refused to let him die. And Diane had fired her for it. The realization hit Harrison harder than the lack of oxygen. The woman who saved him had been discarded like trash by the people who claimed to serve him. It was a profound, sickening betrayal that rewired his entire understanding of his own existence. He was surrounded by parasites. If he had died on that floor, Diane wouldn't have grieved. She would have held a press conference to assure shareholders of a smooth transition. Harrison reached for the bedside phone, his movements stiff and painful. He ignored the time. It was nearly 1 a.m. He dialed a number from memory that only 5 people in the world possessed. It rang once. "Mr. Whitmore?" A deep, calm voice answered instantly. There was no sleep in the voice, only readiness. This was Leo Sterling, Harrison's head of personal security, and, more accurately, the man who cleaned up messes that lawyers couldn't handle. "Leo!" Harrison rasped, his throat still raw and bruised. "I need you to work tonight." "I heard about the incident at Laura, sir. Are you all right?" "I'm alive, which is more than some people in that room wanted," Harrison said darkly. "Leo, listen to me. The server at the restaurant, the one who performed the Heimlich." "Yes, sir. The police report identified her as Sarah Jenkins, 28. No prior record." Diane had her fired immediately after the ambulance left. Greg Farnsworth kicked her out the back door without her pay. There was a loaded silence on the other end of the line. Even Leo, a man who had seen the darkest corners of corporate espionage, seemed stunned by the pettiness. "That is unfortunate, sir." "It's unacceptable," Harrison growled, wincing as the anger flared the pain in his ribcage. "It is a stain on my name. Diane is worried about liability. She just created the biggest liability of her career." Harrison gripped the phone tighter. "Leo, I want you to find Sarah Jenkins. I don't care what time it is. I don't care where she is. You find her, and you bring her to me." "Sir, it's the middle of the night. You're in the hospital." "Tomorrow morning, then. First thing." "And Leo?" "Yes, Mr. Whitmore?" "Look into Greg Farnsworth at Laura. I want to know everything. His debts, his habits, his little side deals. If he likes to mistreat staff on my property, I want to know exactly how deep that rot goes. And freeze Diane's access to the executive accounts, all of them, pending an internal review." "Understood, sir. Consider it done." Harrison hung up the phone. The pain medicine was pulling him back towards sleep, but the rage kept him anchored. He had spent a lifetime accumulating power. Tomorrow, he was going to start using it for something other than greed. The morning after saving a billionaire's life, Sarah Jenkins woke up shivering. The heat in her tiny basement apartment in the Rogers Park neighborhood had gone out again, and the frosty Chicago air was seeping through the cracked window frames. For a few blissful seconds between sleep and wakefulness, she forgot. Then, the memories of the previous night crashed down on her. The adrenaline, the crack of the rib, the relief, and then the crushing humiliation in Greg's office. She rolled out of her narrow bed, her body aching as if she'd run a marathon. She wrapped herself in a blanket and walked into the kitchenette. The digital clock on the microwave blinked, 8:30 a.m. She opened her banking app on her cracked phone. The balance stared back at her, cruel and unblinking. $42.18, that was it. That was her entire financial existence. She sat at her small, wobbly kitchen table and put her head in her hands. Rent was due tomorrow, $850. Her landlord, Mr. Henderson, a man with all the warmth of a slumlord caricature, had already warned her that being late again meant eviction proceedings. And then there was Maya. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her younger sister, Maya, a sophomore at Northwestern. "Hey Sari, just got my midterms schedule." The bazaar's office sent another reminder about the remaining tuition balance for this semester. "It's due next Friday." "Dad said you had it covered." "Love you." Sarah stared at the screen until the words blurred through hot, stinging tears. Their father, a sweet man whose construction accident 5 years ago had started their financial downward spiral, couldn't help. He was barely surviving on disability checks. Sarah had promised Maya, that she would handle the tuition gap. That's why she was working double shifts at Laura, letting Greg treat her like dirt. She couldn't tell Maya. Not yet. Maya was the smart one, the hope of the family. Sarah couldn't let her drop out. Sarah wiped her face aggressively. Crying wouldn't pay the rent. She got dressed in her warmest clothes, layers of thrift store sweaters, and spent the next 8 hours pounding the pavement. It was a humiliating tour of the city's service industry. She walked into diners, coffee shops and bars, asking for applications. At a busy downtown lunch spot, the manager looked at her resume. "You worked at Laura? That's high-end stuff. Why'd you leave?" Sarah hesitated. It was a difference of opinion regarding protocol. The manager narrowed his eyes. "I know Greg Farnsworth. He's tough, but he runs a tight ship. If he let you go, there was a reason. Sorry, we're not hiring." It happened 3 more times. The restaurant world in Chicago was surprisingly small. By 5 p.m., Sarah was frozen to the bone, exhausted, and more hopeless than when she started. She used $3 of her remaining $42.18 to buy a cup of coffee just to warm her hands on the walk back to the train. As she walked past a newsstand, she saw the front page of the Chicago Tribune. There was a small blurb in the bottom corner. "Billionaire developer Harrison Whitmore hospitalized after dining incident." The article was vague, mentioning a medical episode, and stating that Whitmore Holdings assured investors it was business as usual. There was no mention of the waitress who had saved him, no mention of the chaos. It had all been sanitized by high-priced PR firms like the one Diane Caldwell ran. Sarah Jenkins didn't exist in their world. She was just collateral damage. She got back to her freezing apartment around 6:30 p.m. The sun had set, and the basement unit was gloomy and shadowed. She didn't turn on the lights to save electricity. She sat on her sagging couch, still in her coat, eating dry cereal straight from the box because her milk had spoiled. It had been almost exactly 24 hours since she walked into Laura for her shift. 24 hours since she was a gainfully employed, struggling woman. Now she was just struggling. She looked around the dismal room. This was it. She was going to be evicted. Maya would have to leave school. The shame of letting her family down was a physical weight crushing her chest. She felt utterly defeated, a tiny cog crushed by a massive, indifferent machine. Knock. 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 Sarah jumped, spilling cereal on herself. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It had to be Mr. Henderson looking for the rent a day early. He often did that, trying to intimidate her. She didn't want to open it. She wanted to curl into a ball and disappear. Knock, knock, knock. Louder this time, authoritative. "Coming," she called out, her voice shaking. She walked to the door, bracing herself for Mr. Henderson's oily sneer and threats. She unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open just a crack, ready to beg for a few more days. "Mr. Henderson, I don't have it yet, but I promise by Monday." She stopped. It wasn't Mr. Henderson. Standing in the dimly lit hallway of her basement building was a man who looked like he had just stepped out of a spy movie. He was huge, easily 6'4", wearing a perfectly tailored black wool coat that probably cost more than Sarah's car. His face was rugged, impassive, and his eyes were sharp, taking in everything: her shabby clothes, the cold apartment behind her, the fear in her eyes. "Miss Sarah Jenkins?" the man asked. His voice was deep, calm, and utterly terrifying in its professionalism. Sarah gripped the doorframe. "Yes? Who are you? Are you with the police? Because Greg said he wouldn't press charges for the rib—" "I am not with the police," the man interrupted gently but firmly. "My name is Leo Sterling. I work for Mr. Harrison Whitmore." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Diane Caldwell had sent someone. They were going to sue her. They were going to destroy whatever little she had left. "Look, I didn't mean to hurt him," Sarah stammered, backing away, trying to close the door. "I was just trying to help. Please, just leave me alone. I already lost my job. I have nothing else you can take." Leo Sterling reached out a massive hand, not to force the door open, but to hold it steady. "Miss Jenkins, please breathe," Leo said, his tone surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. "You misunderstood. I am not here to take anything from you." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. Sarah flinched, expecting a subpoena. Instead, he pulled out a sleek, black envelope with the embossed silver W logo of Whitmore Holdings. "Mr. Whitmore is awake," Leo said, holding the envelope out to her. "He has been made aware of the unfortunate actions taken by Ms. Caldwell and Mr. Farnsworth last night. He is extremely displeased with how you were treated." Sarah stared at the envelope, her hand trembling too much to take it. "What is that?" "Mr. Whitmore would like to speak with you personally. He is still in the hospital, but he insisted I bring you to him tonight. This envelope contains a small token of his immediate gratitude for saving his life." Sarah hesitatingly reached out and took the envelope. It felt heavy. "He wants to see me?" she whispered. "Yes, ma'am. My car is outside. If you would be so kind as to come with me, we can address this entire misunderstanding. And Miss Jenkins—" Leo's stony face softened just a fraction. "Pack an overnight bag. I don't believe you will be staying in this apartment tonight." The backseat of Leo Sterling's black Maybach was warmer than Sarah's apartment had been in 3 months. The leather seats were heated, the air smelled faintly of expensive cedar, and the silence of the insulated cabin was absolute. Sarah sat rigidly, her small overnight duffel bag clutched to her chest like a shield. The black envelope rested on her lap. She hadn't opened it. She was too terrified that it was some kind of trick, a legal waiver she was supposed to sign before they truly ruined her life. Leo caught her eye in the rearview mirror as they glided onto Lakeshore Drive. "You should open it, Miss Jenkins," Leo said quietly. "Mr. Whitmore is not a man who deals in tricks, not with the people who save his life." With trembling fingers, Sarah broke the silver wax seal. Inside was a single piece of thick, cream-colored cardstock and a slip of bank paper. She pulled the paper out first. It was a certified cashier's check made out to Sarah Jenkins. She stared at the number. She blinked hard, rubbing her eyes, sure the dim streetlights flashing by were playing tricks on her. It was for $150,000. Sarah gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. The sound was so loud in the quiet car that Leo glanced back again. This is a mistake," Sarah stammered, tears instantly brimming in her eyes. "I can't take this. This is too much." "Mr. Whitmore values his life at considerably more than that, Miss Jenkins," Leo replied, his tone entirely matter-of-fact. He considered that a modest starting point to cover your immediate inconveniences. Sarah pulled out the cardstock. On it, written in sharp, sprawling black ink, were 2 sentences. "Courage is the rarest commodity in my world. I apologize for the cowards in my employ." 20 minutes later, Leo escorted her past 3 security guards and through the heavy double doors of the VIP recovery wing at Northwestern Memorial. They stopped outside a corner suite. Leo knocked once and pushed the door open. Harrison Whitmore was sitting up in the hospital bed. The monitors were gone, but he looked bruised and exhausted. His legendary intimidating aura, however, was fully intact. He was looking over a tablet, but as Sarah walked in, he set it down. For a long moment, the billionaire and the fired waitress just looked at each other. "Miss Jenkins," Harrison said, his voice a gravelly rasp. He pressed a hand gently against his bandaged ribs. "I believe I owe you my life. And an apology." Sarah stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed. "You don't owe me an apology, Mr. Whitmore. I just did what anyone should have done." "But they didn't," Harrison countered, his eyes narrowing with a sudden, fierce intensity. "That is the point. 50 people in that room. People whose salaries I pay. People who call themselves my friends. They all froze. Diane Caldwell, a woman I trusted with half my empire, stepped away from me. You were the only one who stepped forward. And for that, my staff stripped you of your livelihood." Sarah looked down at her worn boots. "Greg was just following protocol. He said I was a liability." Harrison let out a harsh, bitter laugh that ended in a wince of pain. "Greg Farnsworth is a parasite who skimmed off the top of my wine cellar to pay off his gambling debts. Leo has spent the last 4 hours looking into Mr. Farnsworth's meticulous little life. He won't be a problem for much longer." Harrison gestured to the chair beside his bed. "Sit, please." Sarah sat, still gripping her bag. "Leo told me about your background," Harrison continued, his gaze piercing. "You have 90 credits toward a degree in finance at the University of Chicago. You dropped out 3 years ago when your father was injured. You've been working 70-hour weeks to pay your sister's tuition at Northwestern. You are brilliant with numbers, but you're drowning in a system that doesn't care about you." Sarah felt a flush of defensive pride. "I'm surviving, Mr. Whitmore." "You are surviving. I want you to conquer," Harrison said flatly. "That check in your pocket, that pays off your dad's medical debt, your sister's tuition, and your rent. But that is just a thank you. What I am about to offer you is a future." Sarah frowned in confusion. "A future? Diane Caldwell is done," Harrison stated, his voice turning to ice. "She proved her absolute incompetence in a crisis, but more importantly, she proved her disloyalty. I am firing her on Monday morning. I am also tearing Whitmore Holdings down to the studs to root out anyone else who shares her corporate cowardice. But to do that, I need someone in my inner circle who isn't blinded by greed. Someone who acts when the room is paralyzed." Harrison leaned forward, ignoring the pain in his chest. "I am offering you a position as my personal executive liaison. A starting salary of $250,000 a year, full benefits, and I will personally pay for the remainder of your degree at UChicago. You will be my eyes and ears. You will audit the very departments Diane Caldwell used to run. Sarah felt the room spin. Mr. Whitmore, I'm a waitress. I haven't even finished my degree. People in your company will eat me alive. Harrison smiled, and for the first time, it was a genuine, terrifying predator's smile. Let them try. You broke my rib to save my life, Sarah. I think you can handle a few overpaid executives. The morning air in Chicago was brutal, a sharp, bitter wind whipping violently off the icy expanse of Lake Michigan. But the climate inside the penthouse boardroom of Whitmore Holdings was perfectly, artificially controlled. At exactly 8:45 a.m., Diane Caldwell poured herself a cup of single-origin pour-over coffee, catching her own immaculate reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. Below her, the sprawling skyline of the city, a skyline Harrison Whitmore had spent 3 decades building, stretched out like a conquered kingdom. Diane smiled, sipping her coffee. She had spent the entire weekend laying the groundwork for a massive, albeit temporary, transition of power. Harrison's medical episode was a vulnerability, a crack in his impenetrable armor, and Diane intended to exploit it fully. She had already drafted a press release naming herself Acting Chief Executive Officer, ready to deploy the moment the market opened. Behind her, the 6 senior vice presidents of Whitmore Holdings filed into the room, taking their respective seats. Their faces were masks of carefully calculated concern, though their eyes darted around like sharks sensing blood in the water. "Let's bring this meeting to order," Diane said smoothly, taking the plush leather chair at the head of the table, Harrison's chair. As you are all aware, Harrison is recovering from an unfortunate medical incident at Laura on Friday evening. I've spoken extensively with the PR team. We are spinning this as a minor fatigue and dehydration issue. However, until he is fully medically cleared, I am assuming total executive control of the firm. Our first order of business is pushing through the Southside zoning permits today. The London consortium is getting incredibly antsy, and I will not let a momentary lapse in Harrison's health cost us a billion-dollar deal. At exactly 9 a.m., the heavy, soundproofed oak doors of the boardroom unlatched with a loud, definitive click. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Harrison Whitmore did not look like a man ready to hand over the keys to his empire. He looked pale, certainly, and he leaned heavily on a polished ebony cane to ease the excruciating weight off his broken ribs. But his posture was rigid, and his eyes were pure, uncut obsidian. He exuded a dangerous, quiet, simmering wrath. Flanking his left shoulder was Leo Sterling, a silent mountain of a man who made the seasoned, ruthless executives instinctively pull their elbows in and hold their breath. But it was the person, standing on Harrison's right, who caused Diane's perfectly sculpted jaw to physically drop. Sarah Jenkins walked into the epicenter of Chicago's corporate power, wearing a sharply tailored, charcoal-gray wool suit that Leo had arranged for her over the weekend. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, professional twist, her posture impeccable, her chin held high. She didn't look anything like the exhausted, terrified girl who had been crying in a freezing alleyway 48 hours prior. She didn't look like a waitress. She looked like she belonged in this room. She looked like a weapon. "Harrison," Diane gasped, scrambling to her feet, her heavy chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "What are you doing here? You belong in a hospital bed under observation. And what is she doing here?" Diane pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at Sarah. The thick veneer of her corporate composure was cracking rapidly, giving way to shrill panic. "Security! Leo, what is wrong with you? This is the waitress who assaulted him. She is a massive legal and PR liability to this company. Get her out of this building immediately." Harrison didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Sit down, Diane." The command was spoken so quietly, with such absolute, chilling authority, that two of the vice presidents physically flinched in their seats. Diane froze, her finger still pointing uselessly in midair. Harrison walked slowly, painfully, toward the head of the table. He didn't ask Diane to move. He simply stood beside her until the sheer, oppressive, gravitational pull of his presence forced her to step aside. He didn't sit in his chair. He looked around the long mahogany table at the men who ran his company. "Liability," Harrison repeated, tasting the word, letting it hang heavily in the sterile air. "That is the exact word you used on Friday night, Diane, when you fired the only person in a room of 50 people who had the courage to save my life." "Harrison, please, I was protecting the firm," Diane pleaded, her voice pitching an octave higher as desperation set in. "She broke protocol. She manhandled you in front of the London investors. It was a chaotic, unvetted response that humiliated you." "I was dying, Diane," Harrison cut in, his voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural growl. "I was choking to death on the floor, and you stepped backward. You worried about your silk dress getting wet. You worried about the optics. This woman," he gestured to Sarah, "stepped forward. She broke my rib, and in doing so, she gave me 30 more years to clean up the profound rot inside my own house." With his free hand, Harrison dropped a thick, leather-bound dossier onto the polished mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud that made everyone jump. "Over the weekend, while you were busy drafting internal memos to usurp my position, Leo and his team bypassed your security clearances," Harrison stated, tapping the dossier with his index finger. "We did a deep dive into the Southside zoning project you've been pushing so aggressively. We found the shell companies, Diane. We found the lucrative kickbacks you were funneling to the city alderman's brother. We found the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands." Diane's face instantly drained of all color, turning the shade of old parchment. She looked like she was going to be physically sick. "Harrison, those are legitimate consulting fees. You're misinterpreting the data. You're on heavy painkillers. You aren't thinking clearly." "I have never been thinking more clearly in my entire life," Harrison interrupted, his tone turning to absolute ice. "You are terminated, Diane, effective this very second. You are stripped of all equity. Your stock options are completely voided under the gross misconduct clause of your employment contract. And my legal team is currently forwarding this entire dossier to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI, and the IRS." Diane looked wildly around the room, desperately seeking an ally, a lifeline, among the vice presidents she had worked with for years. They all stared firmly at their yellow notepads, completely refusing to make eye contact. In the ruthless corporate jungle they inhabited, the apex predator had just returned to the pride, and the weakest member of the herd was being violently culled. "You can't do this to me," Diane whispered, her voice trembling with a chaotic mix of fury and absolute, paralyzing terror. "I built this division. I made you billions. You need me." "I needed someone to help me when I couldn't breathe," Harrison replied coldly, devoid of any sympathy. "You failed that test. Leo, escort Ms. Caldwell to the lobby. If she attempts to access any company server or shred a single document on her way out, have her arrested for corporate espionage." Leo stepped forward, his massive hand resting lightly but firmly on Diane's shoulder. "This way, Mum." Defeated, publicly humiliated, and facing the very real prospect of federal prison, Diane Caldwell numbly grabbed her designer purse. As she walked toward the heavy boardroom doors, she locked eyes with Sarah. The former waitress didn't look away, didn't gloat, and didn't shrink under the hateful glare. Sarah simply offered a polite, tight-lipped nod, the exact same professional empty courtesy she had given Diane before pouring her sparkling water, just 3 nights ago. Diane swallowed hard, turned away, and disappeared down the hallway forever. At that exact moment, 20 blocks south, Greg Farnsworth pulled his leased, overly expensive BMW into the narrow alleyway behind Laura. He was carrying his clipboard, already mentally preparing to scream at the prep cooks for the lunch rush. But as he approached the heavy steel back door, his shiny dress shoes crunched to a halt. A massive, heavy-duty steel padlock was bolted to the doorframe. Taped squarely to the center of the metal door was a bright neon orange notice. Greg dropped his clipboard, his heart sinking rapidly into his stomach. Notice of immediate eviction and lease termination. Property of Whitmore. Real estate holdings. All assets seized pending review. Greg pulled out his phone, his hands shaking frantically as he dialed the restaurant owner's personal number. It went straight to a disconnected voicemail. He checked his email. Nothing. Then a text message pinged from Chef Francois. They locked us out. Owner says Whitmore pulled the lease an hour ago. We're all fired. Thanks for playing hero with the billionaire, Greg. You ruined all of us. Greg slumped heavily against the freezing, damp brick wall of the alleyway, the exact spot where he had banished Sarah Jenkins into the cold night just a few days ago. His massive gambling debts were due to a very unforgiving bookie on Friday. His career was entirely over. The city's high-end restaurant industry was a tight-knit web, and word was already spreading like wildfire that Greg Farnsworth had personally endangered Harrison Whitmore's life. He was totally blacklisted. It was over. Back in the penthouse boardroom, the silence was still deafening. Harrison finally took his seat at the head of the table, resting his cane against the armrest. He looked calmly at the 6 remaining, pale-faced executives. "Gentlemen," Harrison said smoothly, the dangerous edge in his voice replaced by a terrifyingly calm, business-as-usual tone. "I'd like to formally introduce you to Miss Sarah Jenkins. She is my new executive liaison and head of internal auditing." Sarah stepped forward, taking the plush leather chair directly to Harrison's right, the chair Diane had just vacated. "Miss Jenkins has my complete, unquestioned authority," Harrison continued, his eyes daring any of the men to challenge him. "She will be reviewing every expense report, every contract, and every vendor agreement this company has signed in the last 5 years. If you have been hiding anything, I suggest you confess it to her by noon today. If she finds it tomorrow, I promise you will share Diane's fate." Sarah looked around the massive mahogany table. She saw the most powerful, wealthy men in Chicago staring back at her, terrified of what she might uncover. A few days ago, she was an invisible ghost to people like this, carrying their dirty plates, desperate for a $5 tip just to keep her apartment's heat turned on. She had been powerless, humiliated, and discarded without a second thought. But she hadn't let it break her. She had done the right thing when it mattered most, and the universe had dramatically, violently balanced the scales. Sarah reached into her sleek, new leather briefcase and pulled out a fresh, completely blank notebook. She set it deliberately on the table, unclicked her silver pen, and looked directly into the eyes of the senior vice president of acquisitions. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, her voice remarkably steady, clear, and ringing with a quiet, unshakable authority. "Shall we begin? Sarah Jenkins's story proves that true character isn't defined by the title on your name tag, but by how you act when the pressure is on. She risked everything to do the right thing, and while the corrupt system tried to crush her, fate, and one powerful man's realization of the truth, flipped the script entirely. Sometimes, the darkest moments, the ones that feel like absolute rock bottom, are just the universe clearing the stage for your ultimate comeback. If you loved this dramatic twist of fate and believe that karma always comes to collect, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that good deeds don't go unrewarded, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible, real-life stories of justice, revenge, and ultimate triumphs.